if the president's meeting with Putin goes well, he might dial down his rhetoric on India. He might dial down the pressure on India related to its purchases of Russian oil.
Hello and welcome to StratNewsGlobal. This is Nayanima Basu and you are watching The Gist. I am joined today by Mr. Mark Linscott. He's the senior advisor of the USISPF and he's also the former assistant USTR in the Donald Trump first administration. Welcome, Mr. Linscott, and thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you so much, Nayanima. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. So I'll directly ask you a question which is there in everyone's mind, and this is something that is weighing down, the talks that are going on between US and India. Is it really about market access, or there is a larger issue that is staring both these countries, which probably is not meeting the eye?
Well, in fact, centrally, I think it's all about leverage and leveraging, and the president feeling that he should strike deals, and he is a deal maker, and that's what we encountered over the last 10 days or so on the trade front, when many of us had anticipated that there would be a trade deal on the reciprocal tariffs. That didn't happen, and he didn't have the opportunity to be directly engaged. And then many of us, I certainly was, blindsided by his posts on True Social about purchases of Russian oil. So we had kind of a new set of objectives for President Trump and his administration that directly related to India. And here it seems that he's been leveraging his desire to strike a deal with Russia on Ukraine, and India being kind of caught in the middle of that. So that's how I'm reading. That's how I'm assessing these developments. It's been challenging. I mean, we've seen so much from this president during his first term, during the first 6 months of this term. But his comments directed at India were surprising, unfortunate, highly provocative, very aggressive. And hopefully there's only one direction at this point, and that's up.
Mm-hmm. What kind of market access do you think the US really wants, if it's really about market access? Because you were US's envoy to the World Trade Organization. You know the kind of sensitivities India has in all its trade agreements when it comes to agriculture and dairy products. So I'm sure when the talk started, the US was very well aware about India's sensitivity. So what is the kind of market access really does the US want at this point of time?
Yeah, well, I think the negotiators on both sides had worked for months together. This was at the chief level and then at the ministerial level as well, with Howard Lutnick and Jameson Greer on the US side, and Piyush Goyal on the Indian side. I think there was at least a picture of what could be accomplished as part of an interim agreement associated with reciprocal tariffs. That then was for the president to consider. The president is the trade negotiator in chief of this administration, and my sense, my educated guessing, I guess, was that these sensitive agriculture items were not part of those discussions. I think they are issues for down the road. The ambition is for a much larger bilateral trade agreement that's likely to take a year plus, maybe several years to negotiate. But I didn't see them as being really at issue as part of an interim agreement. Now, the president makes the final call, and who knows what he now expects on the
Hmm.
trade front. He said with some of these countries like Vietnam is opening up 100%. It's hard to believe, but and I certainly don't think that could be the case with India, but that's where we still lack some clarity.
Hmm. But if you ask about, in India, many experts believe that this is not really about market access. This is not really about trade. This has got to do more with geopolitics. And we know that in all these months of trade negotiations, we do have, a very difficult time that have happened between India and Pakistan on Operation Sindoor, and probably President Trump is looking for some kind of credit flowing in from India's side. Probably, maybe he expects Prime Minister Modi to give him a call or something like that.
Yeah, well, I think that there's some clear misunderstandings between the two sides and at the leader level. And uh, ideally, there would have been a a phone call, some kind of direct engagement, specifically on the trade matters to try to hammer out a reciprocal trade deal, a deal on the reciprocal tariffs, and that didn't happen. I don't think it would be accurate to suggest that this is not about trade at all. I mean, it certainly is about trade. There have been months of negotiations, months of efforts on both sides, high level efforts. The president has repeatedly talked about India, specifically on trade. He even predicted that there would be a trade deal. So it's clearly about trade, but that doesn't mean that other developments and other factors don't feed into efforts to get a trade deal. And there's been a lot of reporting involving multiple countries recently about strategic issues being brought into trade negotiations, and now we are seeing that with India, and certainly the purchases of oil from Russia now being part of the equation here. But the trade issues are still very important to this administration. I wouldn't discount that at all.
Hmm. But despite all that has happened, and as you said, the tone had been quite aggressive, and it is kind of turning aggressive even on India's side now. Given the current scenario, do you think that the talks will continue, because there's a trade delegation that's expected to come here uh, by the end of this month? Do you think that will go on? Because what we are hearing from the US is kind of mixed signals that maybe the talks will get postponed or they will be cancelled because the president is kind of angry.
Yeah, I've not heard any reliable reports that the trip's been pulled down or will be pulled down. And again, the the negotiations are dynamic and progressive in many respects, sequential. There's been already the two sides have been looking down the road to continuing negotiations on a larger bilateral trade agreement. And I think the plans for a USTR delegation to come to Delhi the week of August 24th was all about starting to take up that larger agenda, whether or not there's an interim deal on trade. So it's possible that it could get pulled down, but I don't think it has yet. I hope that it is not pulled down. There's a lot of important work to do. There's there's a need to clear the air, both at the leader level, but I think at negotiator level too, on trade. So I certainly hope that that meeting does take place later this month.
Mhm. You were also very closely watching the negotiations that were taking place during the first tenure of the Trump administration. Now, at that time, also, we were hearing similar issues coming up on market access. So, this time, do you think, was there any kind of fresh thinking, or, maybe giving them more in terms of access to pharmaceuticals? What is it? Or the issues were the same?
Uh, yeah, I was the first negotiator on that effort related to India's benefits under the GSP program, the Generalized System of Preferences program, and then I left USTR mid-course while those negotiations were still ongoing. There are some parallels. There are some issues that were on the table at that time in that negotiation that are still on the table in these current negotiations. So there's some overlap. There are some parallels in terms of the two sides trying to do unprecedented things bilaterally on trade, but they're also very different. That first effort under the first Trump administration was not nearly as ambitious. It related specifically to India's benefits under the GSP program. There were a limited number of market access issues that were being negotiated. It would have been significant if a deal had been struck, but the two countries now and the negotiators on both sides are going for a much bigger set of issues and market access interests. Tariffs across the board, non-tariff barriers across the board. Ultimately, as part of a bilateral trade agreement, trade and services, issues like intellectual property rights, I expect to be public procurement. I expect to be on the agenda down the road. So this is a bigger negotiation. The objectives are much broader, and I think that's a positive thing. Even though we've had a setback, there's no doubt about that. I think both sides need to keep the eye on the ball, and ideally we can have the leaders, have a call, clear the air, and the negotiations can continue.
Mhm. But what are you really hearing from American investors or businesses? Because when the United States president calls a country a dead economy, and you have so much at stake, right? You have a defense partnership, you have a high technology partnership, and there are so many partnerships we have across the board. So, what is it that some of your members, especially American investors, are telling you? Especially, given the fact that you are also negotiating a mega sort of trade deal with China.
Yeah, I think a lot of many stakeholders, regret that the president does engage in that kind of rhetoric, those kinds of rhetorical flourishes that can be quite offensive to, the target of those comments. I mean, to refer to the Indian economy as a dead economy, one, is not accurate, and two, is likely to ignite a lot of a lot of resentment in the response. But stakeholders also discount what is said. I mean, there's a long history now of the president making comments like that. What's more important to them is the effort on both sides to strike trade deals, to reach new understandings, to create new market access, to avoid new tariffs. So the tariffs are central in their thinking. I mean, if we have a scenario, well, we currently have a scenario of a 50% plus tariff being applied to India, the plus part being the stacking of MFN tariffs on top of 50%.
Right. And there could be penalties.
Yeah, that would have very serious consequences, very serious implications for the economies of both countries, and particularly India. And investors are concerned about that. If we did have a scenario of 50% tariff, they would have to start to factor that into the investments they already have in India and investments for the future. I think the implications would be very substantial.
Mhm. Also, if the matters go, worse from what we are currently seeing, there is this thinking going on within India, is the fact that when you talk of penalties, there could be secondary sanctions. Are you also getting to hear that maybe there can be a scenario where secondary sanctions can be imposed on India? Because then that will be really disastrous for the bilateral relationship on the whole.
Yeah, well, a 25% penalty tariff is essentially a secondary sanction.
Okay.
You know, I hope that it wouldn't go any further than that in terms of there being actions against specific companies and that realm of secondary sanctions. You know, the immediate um, the immediate challenge is this 25% tariff associated with purchases of oil from Russia. I mean, that I think both sides need to focus on that immediately, and it probably will require a leader level uh, communication to reach an understanding associated with that. Additionally, it would be ideal if they could talk about the reciprocal tariff, the separate uh, 25% reciprocal tariff, and whether there could be a deal on trade that could reduce that reciprocal tariff along the lines of what was done with Japan, with South Korea, with the European Union, and others. So there basically are two aspects of what's on the agenda in coming weeks, I think.
Hmm. But do you think, because India has made it very clear that it will not stop purchasing Russian oil, uh, and then we also have a scenario where the president will be meeting Russian President Putin in Alaska, and India has endorsed that. So, where do you see things go from there?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, and we're venturing into the strategic issues, which I'm always wary about engaging on. I'm a trade expert, a trade geek, and so I'm always a little hesitant to provide opinions on these strategic issues. But that said, you know, I I've got to believe that there is some creative thinking that could get to a compromise related to those purchases. And there have been precedents in the past between the United States and India regarding purchases of oil from third countries. Um, you know what will be necessary is for the leaders to talk about that. If the president's meeting with Putin goes well, he might dial down his rhetoric on India. He might dial down the pressure on India related to its purchases of Russian oil. But it's very unpredictable at this point in time. The one thing we can predict is that in coming days and coming weeks, there's going to be a lot of action on this front, and hopefully it will be to a good end, and we will be back on track in our bilateral relationship.
Right. And Mr. Mark Linscott, if I can ask you the last question, and I know it's quite early morning in DC, is the fact that it has become a political hot potato in India as to why there should be a deal at all between India and the United States. Why is it so important to have the BTA? What would you like to say to them?
Well, I expect there are those in the Indian public and in Indian politics that will oppose an agreement between the United States and India no matter what. But from my perspective, to not get an agreement, to not accomplish more on the trade front, to not also continue to build up the strategic relationship would be lose-lose for both sides. There's no winner in that scenario. I think a trade agreement, even an interim one that is then a platform for a broader bilateral trade agreement, is win-win. Our economies are becoming more integrated. We are two of the largest economies in the world, and we will be for the foreseeable future, number one, and in the not too distant future, number three. And we do have strategic interests. So to tie up more economically is really important. I think any opinion that suggests that there should be less trade between the two countries, that there should be de-risking of our economies, I think would be very dangerous. It would not be good for either country.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us and giving us all those details. That was Mr. Mark Linscott, Senior Advisor at the USISPF, telling us what lies ahead for both India and the United States and how the challenges can be addressed. You are watching the interaction on The Gist. Thank you for watching.